Hey, can you hear me?
Hello? Yeah, I can hear you. What's up, buddy?
Well, uh, I guess I'll just throw out a position and you can respond.
Yeah, sure.
Um, so basically, I'm just not convinced by the evidence that the racial discrimination that I'm gonna limit the scope of the conversation to Black people because it makes it simpler. I don't think it constitutes oppression, and I think for sure racism exists. And I think there is some discrimination. And I think that goes in all directions. But the evidence that I usually hear has other plausible explanations other than just everyone's secretly racist and hate Black people.
Gotcha. So, systemic oppression and all that isn't that everyone is secretly racist and hates black people, right? Do you understand what people mean by systemic oppression, or?
I mean, you can explain it.
Sure. So typically, the idea, in a very, very basic, broad sense, if we're just talking about privilege, is that some people have advantages over other people that are based on certain traits that weren't necessarily earned. So these traits could be skin color or starting wealth or family status, et cetera, et cetera. And that the idea is that being black generally doesn't carry with it as many societal advantages or privileges as being white for a variety of reasons.
Okay. That sounds like something that would also describe just natural advantages from birth due to things that aren't society.
Yeah, sure. It could extend to wealth. It could extend to height or health. It could extend to, yeah, there's tons of different things like that. Sure.
Well, so how would you describe your position on this?
I mean, I generally agree with that. I feel like most of these positions are pretty obvious or data backed. What in particular, I guess?
Well, okay, so there's a few things that I feel like are pretty strong. Okay, so I have been convinced in the past that Black people do face this, like, significant systemic oppression, but then when I dug deeper into it, I became unconvinced. So, for example, I don't know what you think about police shootings. I feel like that one's kind of weak. Like, do you feel like police shootings are evidence of this?
Yeah, I feel like it. I mean, that's a super complicated topic though. But I feel like it's probably leans slightly in the direction of that black people get kind of fucked or shafted on that deal.
Well, so I thought so at first, but I looked into it, and there's like a lot of data that makes me think it's probably has nothing to do with like racism and more to do with just
Yeah, I know
statistics.
you're gonna say. I'm not saying you're wrong. I mean, we can't really have this argument because we would have to start getting. I'll put this on my notepad and we can talk about this in the future. But basically, it's going to be that, like, well, the reason why black people are disproportionately shot is because they tend to live in lower income areas and tend to commit more crimes, and the amount of shootings is actually proportional when you start to account for all of these other factors. So it has nothing to do with racism; it just has to do with other factors, right? Is that essentially what we're?
Yeah, I wouldn't limit it to just more crime. I mean, it goes even deeper than that, but yeah, as like a simplified version, basically. So, what would you say in response to that?
I'm not convinced of that argument because of data I've looked into in the past, but we would have to hammer out like a lot of data. So we'll put that point aside for now. I'll just consider it neutral, because I don't have every like analysis on hand to do that. But I can dig through this, and then you can dig through it. We can talk about this. I think the day after tomorrow I'll be free, or maybe even tomorrow if you want. I'll look into this tonight if I have time.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I've got some data, but like specifically, so like what I would look at is, I mean, I can just list a few things. For one, violent crime, the proportion of or percent of perpetrators of felonious police killings. So, who commits violent crimes, who kills police, who commits murders, who's arrested in firearm-related crimes. All of those are proportional to police shootings, just statistically. So, like, black people are in about 40% of police shootings. They're also about 40% of all of those things I just listed. So that's just one thing.
Sure.
So I guess another one is court like sentencing. Like, so I think typically the argument would be that black people face steeper sentences for the same crimes with
Yeah, typically, yeah.
When adjusted for several factors. The factor that doesn't seem to get adjusted for in the studies I've seen is repeat.
Don't say repeat offense. No, I reject that. I mean, we can go into that, but this is like such a highly absurd explanation that it just is so obvious that it can't be that black people are like repeat offenders over and over again, and every single analysis just somehow missed this mitigating factor. It seems incredibly unlikely to me.
Well, do you know for a fact that the studies have taken that into account? Because the ones I've seen have not.
I mean, I haven't dug into the methodology in all of them, but that's like a pretty extraordinary claim. I mean, that's something, again, where, I mean, I guess I can add this and go through it, but this is like one of those things that so many people are behind, and this is like such a simple methodology error that I find it very hard to believe that every single like data analyst and every single person, you know, conservative and people that are driven against that ideology, I just somehow missed this point. Like, oh wait, it's actually the reason why all of these people are, you know, sentenced more. It's just because they're repeat offenders, and we all missed that. That seems really, really, really unlikely.
I mean, I guess that's a fair point. I just have the studies I've read, you know, like I can't speculate on why that this mistake would be made, but I mean, again, the data I've seen backs up the, like, it's consistent with, like, so the rate, the statistics that fit black people aren't inconsistent. Sorry, I'm like not a good public speaker. There's just no inconsistency I'm seeing here. So the rate of repeat offenses is like proportional to the increase in sentencing. That's what I'm trying to say. And also historically, when sentencing guidelines got put in place, that's when we started seeing black people start getting larger sentences compared to the other ethnicities. And I mean, it's still like consistent with what I've been saying. That like,
yeah, this is one of those things where like typically what I do is I usually just go by conclusions and abstracts, because I get really uncomfortable like digging into studies myself, because these aren't my these aren't my areas of education. So I usually rely on like the researcher consensus on it, because it's possible as a layman to miss a lot, and I get worried that I would do that. And just I mean, I can start to like dig through like an entire. I'd probably go through ACLU stuff, because they're the ones that push this issue publicly, like pretty extensively. But again, like it just seems incredibly suspect to me that every single person missed this incredibly obvious confounding factor, like that. Oh well, it's actually just because they repeat commit. Like that just seems incredibly unlikely to me. But yeah,
that's reasonable. That's reasonable. I understand where you're coming from. Yeah. Well, I've got. I don't want to like harp on this issue too much, but I've got like a quote from the United States Sentencing Commission, who they state in a report, a great deal of research over many decades in both state and federal courts has established that most of any gap between racial majority and minority offenders reflects to great extent legally relevant differences among individual group members in the types of crimes committed and in criminal records. No careful student of sentencing research seriously disputes this finding.
Can you link that?
Yes.
Let me just look at the quote real quick.
Probably just Control F. No careful student, I guess. And that's where you can find the rest of the study or report.
All right, and then which part of this do you think has racial, ethnic? All right, let me check. Hold on. This was published in 2004. Sorry, hold on. I'm reading. Give me one sec.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's kind of like unfair. I'm like coming at you with studies and shit.
No,
and you're like
good.
Not prepared.
So it seems like the initial sentence you read, what I read was that it's saying that a large amount of the sentencing disparities can be accounted for with relevant criminal data, right?
Mhm.
And which I think that's generally agreed upon. But then in reading further, even when accounting for that, and at the end of your quote, it still admits that there still seems to be a gap. And then one of the criminal sentencing things that they look at, it seems like, are odds of imprisonment related to drug offenses. And it seems like even here in this report, and this is just one thing, I would have to read this whole thing to like get a grasp on this. It's saying that even when all relevant factors are controlled for, that Black and Hispanic people have a higher chance compared to the norm of being sentenced for these crimes. No?
Yeah, and I mean, there's other factors that go into this. Like, I'm not trying to disprove the entirety. Like, I'm not trying to disprove the idea that there is racial discrimination. I'm trying to raise doubt in like the certainty of at least the scope and the severity of it. And I mean, I can list a few other factors that, I mean, like, you can just like think of that could result in that discrepancy. And
Sure. So what other factors? So in this, I'm just reading this here. The decision to imprison. Figures 4.3 and 4.4 display the results of the Commission's analysis of judges' decisions to use sentencing options other than imprisonment in those zones of the sentencing table where options are permitted. Figure 4.3 presents the percentage increase or decrease of various groups' odds of going to prison in comparison to a contrast group. Odds for Blacks and Hispanics are compared with those for whites. Odds for offenders with no dependents are contrasted with those with dependents. Thanks. Oh, not Sumi, thanks. Odds for offenders with some college, blah, blah, blah. In addition, for these 5 groups, blah, blah, blah. Reading from left to right, the black bar in each, blah, blah, blah. Beginning with the results for Blacks and Hispanics on the left side of figure 4.3, the black bars show that when considering the overall caseload, a typical Black or Hispanic offender has somewhat greater odds of being imprisoned when compared to a typical white offender. The odds of a typical Black drug offender being sentenced to imprisonment are about 20% higher than the odds of a typical white offender, while the odds of a Hispanic drug offender are about 40% higher. So this seems to show that there is some discrimination that exists based on racial differences, or?
well, so I mean, that shows that there's some discrepancy statistically. I don't think that shows that there's discrimination because there's other factors. So, for example, there's things like courtroom demeanor. There's like acceptance or willingness to follow lawyers' advice, things like that, and like quality of public defender in the county in which they're arrested, and all of these other things that you can't like easily account for in a study like this.
Sure. So we can go through things that you're talking about. So when you say things like access to a good public defender, do you think that there might be like a higher chance that certain types of people live in poor areas that?
Right. Yeah, there could be a correlation here.
Sure.
Between
but
racial.
Like, don't you think we can tie socioeconomics to racial discrimination a little bit, or do you not agree with that?
I don't know if you could entirely control out the quality of a public defender based just on socioeconomic factors.
Well, wouldn't being more wealthy give you access to a better lawyer?
Yeah, definitely. That would be a large factor. I don't think it would necessarily be the only.
Sure. Don't you think things like courtroom demeanor could tie into socioeconomic factors a lot as well?
Yeah, certainly. Definitely.
So if we can tie in socioeconomic factors to things, also keep in mind that we're also just assuming that this is a large thing, which I'm giving you this, but you haven't really demonstrated this. I'm just kind of like going along with it, right? I don't necessarily know if the courtroom demeanor of Black people charged for drug offenses is worse than the courtroom demeanor of white people charged with drug offenses. I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I also do not know that.
Sure. But like even assuming that it was, even if I granted you that, I feel like when we talk about courtroom demeanor, we're talking about like your manners, which can come from whether you're part of a whole family or a broken family, what type of school you go to, what type of wealth you have access to. Wealthier people probably have better manners in general than poorer people, for a variety of reasons. And I feel like a lot of socioeconomic factors can be tied into racial things as well. Would you not agree with that?
No, I totally agree with that.
So then even if these other factors were mitigating that were causing these racial, or these causing these sentence disparities, couldn't we still attribute this to some extent to racism at some point, or no?
I don't see that that's being demonstrated convincingly. I think it's like a hint that might be there, but I don't think it's like, oh, look, there's this discrepancy, and we tried to account for some of these factors, but we're still seeing this discrepancy. Because because you can't
Well, but I
account for
mean,
every factor.
you can't account for every factor, but it seems like a lot of factors are trying to be controlled for here. And I feel like it's not really fair to keep saying, well, we can't account for absolutely everything, which I mean
Well,
is
I'm not
true,
trying to
but
set the bar ridiculously high. I just think there's some pretty plausible alternatives to just racial discrimination.
um
Like I think so hypothetically, culture could play a significant role in how a black defendant goes about their court case. Like the mentality you have going into it can play a huge role in the outcome of the case, right?
yeah, but what do you mean by that? Like what would cause a difference between white and black people's mentalities?
Well, I mean, like there's definitely cultural differences, right, between well, I shouldn't. It's not necessarily along racial lines, strictly, but I think on average you could see some things correlated with ethnicity. So,
Sure, but like where do these cultural differences come from?
well, they would be historic. I mean, like it would be a deterministic kind of thing.
Sure, but if some of these cultural differences are caused by racism, doesn't that still kind of make it racism or no?
I so I like this argument. I don't think that would so the position I'm trying to defend is that there's not currently strong evidence to show that there's like current oppression against black people. I'm not trying to argue that there was never oppression which then down the line caused disadvantages which you can still see statistically, because I think that it's completely true that that black people on average do face disadvantages that can be directly traced to historical oppression.
Oh,
But
okay. So
I
like,
don't think that amounts to today. Let's say, for example, I don't think white people are in general contributing to the um, perpetuation of these disadvantages.
um, hold on one second. Was the name of the thing you sent me 30 years study reform?
Something like that, yeah.
30 years of sentencing reform? Fuck, I don't want to dig into this.
I mean, we don't have to stick to one thing. I can grant you that.
No, or it's just because people are like ripping quotes out and I feel bad. I don't want to like quote bomb you. Hold on. So like in this thing, because I don't know if this is from the same study. The findings of this review suggest that the sentencing reforms implemented during the past 25 years have not achieved the goal of amelioration of racial disparities and discrimination. In fact, studies of sentences imposed at the federal level reveal a consistent pattern of disadvantage for black and Hispanic offenders. This pattern is particularly pronounced for the various alternative measures of sentence severity. Although the federal sentencing guidelines severely constrain judges' discretions in deciding between prison and probation and in determining the length of the sentence, they place only minimal restriction on the ability of judges and prosecutors to reduce sentences for substantial assistance or acceptance of responsibility. Mandatory minimum sentences also can be avoided through charge manipulation. As Albanati notes, these process-related decisions offer potential avenues through which prosecutors can circumvent guideline-defined sentence outcomes. The validity of this assertion is confirmed by the fact that each of the 6 federal-level studies that examined an alternative measure of sentence severity found evidence of direct discrimination against both blacks and Hispanics. 30 years of this is from 30 years of sentencing reform, the quest for a racially neutral sentencing process. I don't know if this is the same study. I don't think this is the same thing that he linked, guys.
I think most of that quote is talking about the sentencing guidelines themselves enforcing disproportionately harsh sentences on minorities. which itself is not like actual racism. It's just like it limits the judge's ability to um, show lenience.
Okay. What about that?
Well, I mean, that's just the guidelines just being like, it's not like
Well, so what this is
evidence that.
saying, though, is that judges do have the ability, even though there's minimum sentencing guidelines, judges still have abilities to wiggle around them. So here's an example. Let's say that you come in and you got into a car crash with somebody else, right? You got into a car crash, and I want to charge you with like reckless driving or some felony level charge or whatever, some like willful reckless driving or reckless endangerment or something. Even though there's a minimum sentencing guideline to that, in the negotiation between the defense and the prosecutor, the defense might make an argument that you'll do some criminal justice or criminal service, or I'm sorry, community service, or that you'll plead guilty but you've got a good record, that you go to college or whatever, you're a good kid and it didn't really deserve you. And instead, what they'll do is they'll have you plead guilty. You'll take a plea bargain to a lesser charge so that it doesn't have to go to court and people's times aren't wasted. So in that way, even though there's a minimum sentencing guideline on what the initial charge was for, that charge could be you could be charged with something different because you would plead down your charge to something. And what this study is showing is that those types of racial discriminations allow for more leeway in terms of how judges sentence people. So even though there's still minimum guidelines, we see a difference in the amount of charges that are pled down between white and black people, is essentially what this study was saying. But I feel bad. We would have to do like a comprehensive study evaluation because I'm sure we could throw lines at each other. Apparently, this study is one that was like quoted by this one. But I will say that even the main one you linked me shows a disparity in 20% and 40% between blacks and Hispanics and white people in terms of how they're sentenced for drug-related crimes.
Yeah, I mean, it also shows like a 40% discrepancy in repeat offense and other factors like. But yeah, I mean,
oh, so okay, fuck. So your study was from what year? Or I shouldn't say study, this report.
Let's see, 2004.
Okay, so yours was from 2004. So apparently the United States Sentencing Commission, the USSC, has a new published report that we can view. It's probably, especially because so much has changed over the past few decades. Hold on, I'm just throwing you this link. So under the key findings section of this, and I'm stressing that these are just key findings. If you want to dig into the methodology, it's possible that your same contentions are still there, and this doesn't prove any points for me. But under the key findings, like point 1 is that black male offenders continue to receive longer sentences than similarly situated white male offenders. Black male offenders received sentences on average 19.1% longer than similarly situated white male offenders during the post-report periods, as they had the prior 4 periods studied. The differences in sentence length remain relatively unchanged compared to the post-Gall report. Your contention here is that they're missing some other factors, I guess, and that when they say similarly situated, they're actually missing something that would make them not similarly situated.
Well, I contend that that is a very real possibility.
Sure. And then my contention is that I feel like it would be very strange that every single person has missed a pretty obvious confound, especially when this is such a heated topic.
Well, some of them aren't that easy to control for, like I was saying, like demeanor and what's the word? Attitude towards the process, which I think can be pretty huge.
Yeah, possibly. But I mean, like, it would be nice to have this demonstrated somewhere, you know?
Yeah, I know. It's hard to test for. I'm not trying to say like, hey, look at this argument I have, it disproves discrimination. Like I'm not trying to say that at all. I'm just trying to say like when I see studies that say like
I'm also not even sure if I grant these if these escape from the racism thing though. Because like let's say it does come down to courtroom demeanor. Is it right that the demeanor of an average black person should cause you to sentence them longer than the demeanor of an average white person? Like could you not make arguments that in and of itself is racism?
I see what you mean. I think I have to be more specific. I don't mean like neutral but foreign. stereotypical behavior that differences or something like that. I mean things like suspicion of the process, which causes the defendant to not take their lawyer's advice or something like that. Things like that, or um, not showing remorse, for example, in the courtroom. Things like that. I think it's possible that there could be a perception that black people are more likely to have those issues and that could be racism, but I think it's also totally possible black people on average could be less remorseful and could be less willing to take their lawyer's advice just due to cultural differences.
So these things, I'll admit, are possibilities, but I feel like at this point, the totality of evidence kind of points towards one direction very heavily, and that these are very minor contentions, and I don't feel like there's some super golden nugget of truth that's hidden here, because I feel like we could run down this hole like a lot. So for instance, let's say I would do a study that would demonstrate that the demeanor of black people is actually quite cordial in both cases. Then your next contention could be, well, maybe their demeanor is fine, but the way that they speak is actually significantly different than white people. So even if they're acting polite, their vernacular is offensive. And then I could control for the vernacular, and then maybe it would be, well, maybe the deep voices of black people compared to the higher voices of white
I
people,
wouldn't.
like,
I see what you're saying. I personally wouldn't go that far. I'm not that hard to convince.
Well,
I think
so this is a matter of perspective, because right now you're saying, well, I wouldn't go that far because that's ridiculous. But I think an average person could very easily say, well, your contention that it comes down to demeanor and that explains the 20% sentencing guideline, people would say, well, that's ridiculous. That there's a 20% difference in sentencing guidelines because most black people that go in have a horrible court demeanor compared to the average white drug offender.
I don't think that's ridiculous at all from my admittedly limited court experience. I think following your lawyer's advice as one particular example is extremely important and extremely impactful and not as obvious as it might seem. There are many instances where you cannot follow your lawyer's advice to a T and it can screw you over. And I would not be shocked at all if you saw ethnic correlations there.
Okay, but do we have like any data that points towards black people not following the advice of their lawyers compared to white people? Because this is all conjecture.
Yeah, it is conjecture. I'm not trying to prove a negative here.
Well, I'm raising questions with. Well, like questions are good to raise, and skepticism is healthy. But like when the totality of evidence kind of like points in one direction, and then we're saying, well, what about this possible exception? Like that could be a good area for further investigation. But I don't know if I would just assume.
I don't really agree with that take, though, that the totality of evidence points to racial discrimination when you've got some obvious confounding factors that could completely eliminate the value of that. Like, I think it's very plausible that if you did control for these factors, you would completely eliminate that gap. And
why has nobody thought of this yet?
I don't think that nobody's thought of it. I think it's very hard to test for. I don't think it's also. I think it's also not a very attractive thing to dig into. Really hard, for at least for a lot of people.
Okay, I mean, I feel like courtroom demeanor would be pretty easy to snap a shot and then to quantify things like quality of clothing worn or types of outfits worn. I mean, I feel like this could be studied.
Maybe it has.
I also, it just feels like, I know that you're saying you wouldn't, but I'm very confident that if this data was available, that you could walk back another goalpost. And then instead of saying, well, even though their demeanor is fine, maybe the brand of clothing they wear is offensive, or maybe they have too many tattoos and that's not being accounted for, or maybe there are piercings. Like, I feel like we could jump to a million, and then you could say, like, you know, very clearly, like, a man wearing an earring could be offensive to a lot of older judges, and that could be the difference. Like,
I think appearance, personally, I think appearance is a much more minor and weaker point than
demeanor. Well, what does demeanor mean?
No, I mean, so demeanor would be like, I guess, visible attitude. I don't have like technical terminology here. I'm saying I think those factors would probably be
Well, wait, wait.
relatively
Well, no, no,
minor, I
wait.
would imagine.
I'm curious what you mean by demeanor here. If you're not talking about like way of speaking or jewelry or tattoos or whatever. Like I have a definition for what I think a demeanor is.
Yeah, so that those would be included. There would also be, yeah, like way of speaking, tone.
So do you think like a black person is more likely to walk in and be like, "Yo, fuck this shit, judge. Like, get me out of here," or whatever, as opposed to like a white drug offender? Or
I think that is very possible.
do you have any data to support that, or is that just kind of like
No,
a
of course.
feeling?
That's just conjecture.
Okay, but so if there are mountains of empirical evidence that point in one direction and nobody's been able to find supposedly the very obvious confounds, don't you think it's a little bit absurdly skeptical to be thinking, well, there might actually be these one or two confounds that totally explain
Well,
this massive discrepancy in sentencing?
I don't think that's an accurate way of
So
phrasing it.
which part of
There's not
that wasn't accurate?
the mountain of evidence uh is contingent on these things not
Sure. So
right?
this United
So
States
it's
Sentencing
not
Commission, this is from
so it's not
2017. Your report was from 2007 or whatever. This has been studied for decades and decades. Like some of the studies cited in this are from the 60s. So you don't think in the course of 6 or 7 or 8 decades, nobody has thought to like look at the demeanor of a person in a
well, so
courtroom?
in this report, do they take into account repeat offense?
I'll bet. I mean, I would blind bet like 50
Because I
bucks or
mean,
ten
in the
dollars. You want to bet like a friendly $10? I would absolutely blind bet that because there's no possible way. So okay, so I was being weaker in these statements before, but I'll be a little bit more strong in these statements. There is no possible way that an incredibly obvious confound like repeat offenses hasn't been taken into account in this data. I can make any friendly wager you want there to bet against it, and we can go dig through it. I don't like to dig through it because I know this is a waste of time looking for that, but I am absolutely 100% confident that that confound would have been taken into account because it's so obvious. It's so painfully obvious.
Okay, I mean, I can grant you that. I don't I don't exactly disagree that it's pretty obvious, but
So why
there
would there
are
be decades of studies and an
well
entire report by
because
the
we
USSC
have
that wouldn't take that into account?
we have lots of studies that purport discrepancies in sentencing that don't take that into account. That's like why I brought it up in the first place. Because like when I was researching this, I was trying to find the discrepancy in sentencing, and I found like 4 or 5 studies that didn't take that factor into account. I was like, what? Why? But I mean, I can grant you that this study says there's a 19% longer sentencing, and we can assume that they did take that factor into account.
Sure, and then to be careful, this is less like a study and more like I don't want
That's
to
a
call this
report.
a meta-analysis, but this is like a report that's going to be taking into account the findings of several studies, maybe
Right.
dozens of. I don't know how many are cited in here, so it's not just like a single individual study. This is something that's accounting for. It looks like there's 60 different endnotes. I don't know if that's a different source and everything, but yeah.
Right. But the point I wanted to make is that it's not like we're comparing like, oh, we have all this evidence on one side pointing towards this discrepancy,
The
and then you're
fact that
bringing
he
up
said
this
black
other thing
people are
that could
more
be weighed
likely to
against it. I'm
means
not
that
like
he's
trying to
already
weigh something against it. I'm trying to say if this confounding factor does exist, it completely negates this evidence. It's not like you weigh one against the other. It's like this is all of this evidence is contingent upon it taking into every relevant factor.
Sure. Okay. Well, I mean, let's try to find this then. I'll see if I could find like a study that is.
Well, I mean, it might be easier to talk about another like
Well, no,
do you
because
have
I feel like this point is so ridiculous that now I have to dig and find it because this is brought up to me a lot and it feels like I just usually hand wave it as like extreme naivety. But I'll look. We'll try to actually find like a study sentenced and see if they take into account repeat offenses.
oh well, that's not what I meant. I was saying we can just assume that they did take into account repeat offense,
Mm-hmm.
but that is not the only confounding factor that could completely eliminate the validity of this evidence. Like I think it would be reasonable to say that in general there is a pretty big victim culture in Black American culture, and that can have a significant impact on
What is victim culture?
how
mean?
the outlook that you are always the victim no matter what, basically.
How? What do you mean by that? Like, how does this manifest? I guess.
How this would manifest in a court case is being less willing to just do what your lawyer says to
Okay. So we're going back to
get.
this one thing again about black people are supposedly like constantly not listening to their
It's
lawyers.
just
Is this like,
it's just one example.
well, yeah, but like this is the second time you brought this up. I'm really curious if there's something that I can point to for this. Like this idea that black people like ignore their lawyers all the time while white people listen just seems really strange to me.
Why?
Because I've never seen a data point that like expresses this before.
What data do you expect to point to that? You
So a
can't
poll
measure
based,
everything with data.
you can very easily measure this. So recommendations from lawyers that are ignored by their clients, is there a racial disparity here? Would be something that I would expect to see this.
I guess in a survey from public defenders or what?
Percentage of black versus white plea deal. Maybe people that took plea deals. Okay, research finds evidence of racial bias in plea deals. So maybe more white people take plea deals than black people.
Could be.
A new study from Carlos Verdejo of Loyola Law School finds significant racial disparities in plea deals. It suggests that prosecutors may be using race as a proxy for criminality. Recent studies on racial disparities focus on arrests, initial charging sentences. They generally find that African Americans are more likely to be arrested and charged and then receive harsher sentences than white people. Few researchers have examined the plea bargaining process, even though the overwhelming those deals determine what crime defendants convicted for, which in turn because prosecutors set the starting point for plea negotiation by deciding which initial charges to file, and they are empowered to reduce sentence charges when they draw one. But like just like sentencing, prosecutors may be subject to implicit bias when exercising discretion. And analyzing more than 30,000, so this is just Wisconsin cases over a 7-year period. The study found significant racial disparities in the plea bargaining process. White defendants were 25% more likely than black defendants to have their most serious initial charges dropped or reduced to a less severe charge. Black defendants were more likely than whites to be convicted of their highest initial charge. As a result, white defendants who faced initial felony charges were approximately 15% more likely than similar black defendants to be convicted of a misdemeanor instead. White defendants with no prior convictions were over 25% more likely than black defendants with no prior convictions. Oh, hey, there's something taking into account priors explicitly stated here. So white defendants with no priors were over 25% more likely than black defendants with no priors to receive a charge reduction. The disparities were even greater in misdemeanor cases. White people facing misdemeanor charges were nearly 75% more likely than black people to have all charges dropped, dismissed, or reduced. White defendants charged who had no prior criminal, another with no priors. Hold on.
I mean, is this data on what they're offered or data on what they took?
I'm not sure. Hold on. Oh, you're right. I should have. Okay, hold on. What is this? What is the actual study here, guys? A new study from Carlos Verdejo, not Bendejo. Sorry. Okay, Carlos. Gender disparities, criminalizing racial harassment, and plea bargaining. Okay. So, and what we're getting into very specific stuff, but like, this is citing another study. Finding in a sample of misdemeanor marijuana case in New York County that black defendants are less likely than white defendants to be offered a charge reduction. Plea bargaining process. Oh, fuck, it's... to revisit, what you're saying is that maybe white and black people are offered the same pleas, but black people don't accept them and white people do, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I want to set a reasonable goalpost. If you have a study saying they're not offered,
I'm trying. Hold on, this is
same
getting very, very, very specific. I'm trying. Hold on. Who accept plea deal? This is all going to cite that Carlos and study, I think. Yeah. Ooh, hold on. More than 90% of defendants plead guilty rather than go to trial. Do black... Okay, fuck. Black versus white plead guilty. Race and the probability of pleading guilty. This looks old as fuck. Fuck, from 1990. The legal ramifications of pleading guilty and findings of an interdependence between pleading guilty and sentence severity suggest that the guilty plea decision is a significant turning point in case processing. The present research examines the variables affecting the probability of pleading guilty. The first analysis involves estimating a single probit equation of main effects of variables previously related to pleading guilty. Second analysis, the equation separately for black defendants' minor findings. Okay, I can't. But I'm wholly unconvinced. Like, when I feel like no matter what I can present to you, the feeling I get, and I could be wrong, but the feeling I get is that there's always going to be like a step. There's always going to be like some way out of it. Like maybe this thing isn't being looked at, or maybe this thing isn't being looked at. Hold on. Plea bargaining and charge difference. So if we're talking about differences in plea bargaining, what data are you looking for to convince you that there is that there's racial discrimination taking place?
I think if you have a study, and I don't want to be too hasty or whatever, but I think if you have a study that says that black people are not offered equally good plea bargains as white people, that I would have to concede that. Like I would have to concede that that is racial discrimination.
If what?
If the plea bargains offered when controlling for relevant factors such as repeat offense, if the plea bargains offered are worse or less common with racial discrepancy.
Do white versus black plea bargain offers.
And yeah, it's really specific, but I mean that's like an example that would actually convince me.
And it's gonna go back to this Carlos. All right.
I didn't mean to like force you to look up a bunch of studies.
No, it's okay. Fuck. I saw this paper, didn't I? What changed? Wait, which one was it? Criminalizing race, racial disparities, and plea bargaining. Okay. All right. We're just gonna run it down, boys. Control F black and it comes up. What? There's 244. What are you talking about?
So what do you think about killing babies?
I don't care about abortion. Fuck that topic.
Oh, I didn't mean abortion. I meant like actual life babies.
Oh, I'm generally opposed to it. Okay, hold on. Okay, here's from a BJA study. The Bureau of what? Justice some shit? Justice Assistance. Extra legal characteristics to consider in the research on plea bargaining include race, socioeconomic status, gender, and age. To date, research suggests that some extra legal characteristics make it more likely that a defendant will not receive a reduced plea charge. Studies that assess the effects of race find that blacks are less likely to receive a reduced charge compared with whites. Additionally, one study found that blacks are also less likely to receive the benefits of shorter or reduced sentences as a result of the exercise of prosecutorial discretion during plea bargaining. Studies have generally found a relationship between race and whether or not a defendant receives a reduced charge. There are multiple studies being cited here. Is this adequate, or? While the relationship found between race and receiving a reduced plea has been consistent, research on other extralegal characteristics such as gender and age has shown mixed results. One study found that defendants who are younger or male were less likely to receive reduced charges. Conversely, some evidence suggests that gender was not a significant factor. The most robust analysis suggests that both legal and extralegal characteristics are heavily influenced by prosecutorial discretion and by the region where the case is prosecuted. Thus, whether a defendant receives a reduced charge may depend on where the case is prosecuted and both extra and legal characteristics.
Does that take into account repeat offenders though?
It has to. I mean,
I know there's a lot of studies that don't.
Really? Are there studies that don't, or are there news headlines that don't?
I don't know. I'm not trying to be hard ass. I mean, I could totally be wrong here. Like, I don't want to be like, no, Destiny.
Well,
The
like,
thing
this
you
is
just
one of
said
those
is
things
definitely
where I'm
wrong.
not sure if there's like a lot of like post hoc rationalization going on here. Like,
Well, okay, so for me, I want to give you that one and be like, that's good evidence. Maybe I'm wrong. But I'm still just like, but what's the methodology of that? Are they actually taking into account all these factors? I'm like really hesitant to just throw it in like that. I mean, maybe it's not even that important because our difference of opinion at this point is that you're of the opinion that they probably did take into account this factor because they'd probably be pretty dumb if they didn't. And I'm of the opinion that they likely didn't and they just are dumb. But I don't know if that difference of opinion is all that important.
okay. What,
Nathan thinking.
okay, so if I look up any report with prior convictions in it, as can be seen in figures 14 and 15, the addition of the variable indicating a prior conviction for a violent offense had almost no effect on the contribution of race and gender to the sentence of the offender after controlling for all other factors. For example, after controlling for violence in the offender's criminal history, the difference in sentence length between black male offenders and white male offenders was 20.4%, a difference of only 0.3 percentage points from the results found without the additional data. The difference in sentence length between Hispanic male offenders and white male offenders also changed only slightly from 9.4 to 9.7%. Similarly, the difference in average sentence between the remaining offender groups was virtually identical to what it was without the additional data included in the analysis. So here it seems like that doesn't matter at all.
Well, I have no counter to that one.
Okay. Do you agree that there might be some discrepancy in the criminal justice system related to black people then? Or
Yes.
okay, cool. All right, let's move on from this. What's the next meme?
What do you think about anti-natal?
I don't.
You think childbirth doesn't violate the non-aggression principle?
Fuck no. It's not something I take into account at all.
Yeah, I wasn't totally memeing when I was talking about like baby killing. I'm actually pro-abortion and pro-baby
Okay.
to be accurate. Because well, I mean, it's pretty simple. You can't get consent to create
Yeah, you're
life.
talking about getting consent from. Yeah, I understand the arguments. It's just very boring to me. I don't
Puppy.
care to.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't want to bore you, buddy. So,
Well, is there anything else about the racial discrimination stuff?
well, I don't think I have anything else to say because you gave me good evidence to think that there is racial discrimination,
Okay.
right? So, like, I'm not like trying to. I'm not a partisan.
Okay.
I thought there wasn't good evidence, but you gave me some pretty good evidence that there actually is racial discrimination in the system. So
Gotcha.
you changed my mind.
Wow, cool. All right. Okay, well, hey, thanks for the conversation, buddy, all right? I appreciate it.
All right, thanks for the talk.
All right, have fun.
You too.